Good evening, gentlemen. So today we'll be looking at chapter 2 in our ongoing discussion of taxation law in Nigeria. Chapter 2 talks about the history and development of taxation in Nigeria. So we'll be looking at the historical background and antecedents of taxing and tax law as it concerns the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Now, we said the first written income tax law in Nigeria was the Land Revenue Proclamation Law of 1904, which was enacted by the British Colonial Administration of Lord Lugard. And at the time, this Land Revenue Proclamation Law of 1904 was applicable only in those parts of Nigeria now forming part of northern Nigeria as we have it today. So many of us are already aware that the northern and southern parts of Nigeria, the Federal Republic of Nigeria, were amalgamated in 1914. So laws passed by the British Colonial Administration before 1914 will usually be applicable to the particular, individual protectorates and territories that they were controlling as they gained control from the traditional rulers from time to time. So the Land Revenue Proclamation Law 1904 applied to northern Nigeria. And then for the western and midwestern parts of the country, we didn't get a written taxation law in the West and Midwest till about 1917. In 1917, the Native Revenue Ordinance was passed into law by the British Colonial Administration, applicable, like I said, to Western and Midwestern parts of the country. Now, for the East, there was no written, or at least no record of any written tax law for Eastern Nigeria until the year 1928. In 1928, what was enacted by the British Colonial Administration was the Native Revenue Ordinance. Although it was the same Native Revenue Ordinance passed in the West, which is the 1917 Native Revenue Ordinance, but it didn't apply to the East until 1928, when that same Native Revenue Ordinance of 1917 was now made to apply to Eastern Nigeria, or the areas now forming part of what is today known as Eastern Nigeria. Okay? Now, the way and manner in which the colonial administration was structured at the time is that you had northern Nigeria, you had western and midwestern Nigeria, usually forming part of one block. Then you had eastern Nigeria. While Lagos was separate, it had its own legislative processes, which was different from the other parts of the country. And so, what you have for Lagos is that in 1937, a law known as the Native Direct Taxation Colony Ordinance number 41 of 1937 was passed to provide for taxation law in Lagos. All right, but however, this particular law, Native Direct Taxation Colony Ordinance, only applied to Nigerians, who were then referred to as natives. Right? It only applied to the natives, that is, the Nigerian indigenes living in Lagos. It did not apply to foreigners, which will include the British citizens themselves living in Lagos. All right, but of course that was short-lived because 2 years later, in 1939, the Non-Native Protectorate Ordinance of 1939 was passed, which now provided for taxing of non-natives living in Lagos. Okay, so this was the situation. As in 1939, you had these ordinances applying in different regions and different provinces of Nigeria in more like a scattered format according to the territory of application. All right, that was the position. However, in 1940, which is 1 year after the non-native ordinance was passed for foreigners in Lagos, the British colonial administration now harmonized all these laws that we had earlier mentioned. All right, the 1917, 18, and 28 Native Revenue Ordinance in North, West, and Midwest, and East, and Lagos. They were all amalgamated into one taxation statute in 1940. And that statute was known as the Direct Tax Ordinance number 4 of 1940. Okay, so we can say that the Direct Tax Ordinance number 4 of 1940 was the first single legislation on taxation law in Nigeria. All right, and we'll be correct to say that the first single legislation on taxation law in Nigeria is the Direct Tax Ordinance number 4 of 1940. All right. Now we try to highlight some of the features, or one striking feature of this 1940 law was that it provided for community-based taxation. All right, so in that 1940 law, taxation moved from an individual arrangement or individual thing into a community-based, or a joint-based taxing system. So taxes were imposed on a community as a whole, as against the earlier structure of individualism only, or individuals only. All right, so community-based tax assessment was introduced. In fact, they had to define what a community is in that law so as to make it clear and to avoid, conflict and possible double taxation as a result of any incidents of ambiguity or lack of clarity. So, Section 2, subsection 1 of the 1940 ordinance defined community as any town, village, or settlement, or any locality therein, including a band of nomad herdsmen and individuals within a community. Okay, so that's the definition. So anybody living in that kind of system or in that kind of arrangement is what the ordinance defines as a community.